There are nights that belong to the history of a career. The Tonight Show debut, the album recording, the performance that a review described as extraordinary. The show that became the story people told about you for decades afterward. George Carlin had nights like that. Most accounts of his career are built around them. But there is another kind of night that belongs to the history of a career in a different way. The night when nobody came. When the room held almost no one. When the chairs were empty and the bartender had nothing to do, and the person who had booked the room was somewhere in the back wondering how this had happened. These nights do not appear in retrospectives. They do not have reviews. Nobody writes about them, because nobody who writes about careers finds them useful for explaining how careers are built. And yet they are part of how careers are built. They are the nights that show more clearly than any celebrated performance ever can why a performer performs. Because on a night like that, with almost nobody in the room, the only reason to go out there and do the full show is the one reason that is actually true. Somewhere in the early years of George Carlin's career, in the period before the transformation, before the albums, before the national audience, there was a night like that. A small club in a city that had not sent its audience, a room with more empty chairs than occupied ones, a booking that had not produced what bookings are supposed to produce. And Carlin did the full show. What happened in that room, what the show looked like when it was performed for almost nobody, what the few people present experienced, and what one of them would say about it years later, is a story about something that is difficult to teach and impossible to perform for its own sake. It is a story about the relationship between a comedian and the work itself, when the audience is too small to justify the work by any external standard. What the witness saw, and what they would later describe, was something they had not expected from the circumstances of the room. They had walked into a nearly empty club on a quiet night and found, on the stage, a comedian performing as if the room were packed. Not performing louder to compensate for the silence, not visibly deflated by the empty chairs, not going through the motions of a show that had already, before it started, failed by any measurable standard. Not shortening the material, not cutting bits, not adjusting the set to account for the absence of the audience that should have been there. Just performing, fully, precisely, with complete commitment to each bit, the same commitment, as far as the witness could tell, that the comedian would have brought to a full room. The jokes were constructed and delivered with the same care. The timing was exact. The material moved at the same pace it would have moved if the room had been responding at full volume. The witness found this difficult to understand at first. In their experience of entertainment, limited, as most people's is, to watching rather than performing, the energy of the audience was what made the performance happen. Without the audience, the performance was diminished. That was simply how it worked. But what they were watching was not diminished. It was the same. And that sameness, the specific quality of a performance that was not adjusting itself to the size of the room, was something they had not seen before and would not forget. At some point during the show, the witness understood something about what they were watching. The comedian on the stage was not performing for the people in the room. He was performing for something else, for the material itself, for the shapes of the jokes, for some internal standard that had nothing to do with the number of people available to respond to it. The nearly empty room had not changed what the work was. It had only removed the external confirmation of the work's value, and the work had continued without it. This was, the witness would later say, a more unusual thing to see in a performance than it sounds. Most performers, most people, in most contexts, calibrate what they do to the response they are receiving. The feedback loop between performer and audience is not just an element of the performance. It is, for most performers, what the performance runs on. Without it, the performance shrinks, or changes, or stops. Carlin's performance did none of those things. It continued on its own fuel. The early years of a comedy career are built largely from nights that do not go as planned. The bookings that seemed promising and turned into rooms where nothing worked. The audiences that were too drunk or too distracted or simply wrong for the material. The clubs that had told the comedian one thing about the room and delivered something different. The shows that ended early because nobody was listening, or that ended on time despite the fact that nobody was listening, because the comedian had decided that finishing was more important than the audience's attention. Carlin had accumulated these nights in the same way that all working comedians accumulate them, as the unavoidable cost of building something through performance rather than through theory. You do not learn what your material is by writing it. You learn what it is by performing it. In every possible kind of room, under every possible kind of condition, until the material has been tested against enough reality that you understand what it actually is. The nearly empty rooms were part of that testing. A comedian who has only ever performed for large and receptive audiences has not yet found out what the material is when it has to stand alone, when the energy of a full, engaged room is not there to carry it, when each joke has to do all of its own work without the amplification that a crowd provides. The nearly empty room is where you find out whether the material works or whether it was the audience that was working. For Carlin, in those early years, the nearly empty rooms were also something else, a private audience, an opportunity to perform for the material itself rather than for the people listening to it, to find out, in the specific quiet of an almost empty space, whether what he was building was something he actually believed in or something he had built for the reception it reliably produced. The night in question was not the first nearly empty room of his career, and it would not be the last. But it was the one that produced a witness, a single person in the audience who would later, years afterward, describe what they had seen in terms that made the night mean something beyond its own specific failure to draw a crowd. That witness had come to the club for reasons unrelated to the specific comedian performing. They had not known who George Carlin was. They had walked in because the club was there, or because they needed somewhere to sit for an hour, or for one of the dozens of accidental reasons that place specific people in specific rooms on specific nights without any intention on either side. They sat down. And then the comedian walked out from behind the curtain, and the nearly empty room had its show. The witness stayed for the full show. They had not planned to. They had not come to see a comedy show, had not known who was performing, had had no particular investment in the evening. But once the show began, they found that they could not leave, not because the comedy was preventing them from leaving, not because there was some social contract about staying that applied in a room with almost no one in it, but because what they were watching was in some way they could not fully articulate at the time, worth watching. When the show ended, when Carlin finished the set and thanked the room with the same professional warmth he would have extended to a full house, the witness applauded. Alone in a nearly empty club, for a comedian who had just performed a full set for almost nobody. The sound of one person applauding in a room built for 100 is a particular kind of sound. Carlin acknowledged it, nodded, and walked off stage. Years later, the witness described the night. They described it in terms that made the emptiness of the room beside the point, not something to be explained away or compensated for, but simply the condition under which they had seen something real. They said that Carlin had performed with the same commitment that night as he ever did for any audience, and that the performance had been completely itself, fully formed, fully present, requiring nothing from the room that the room was not in a position to provide. That quality, the quality of a performance that does not depend on the room's response for its own completeness, is one of the most difficult things to build in any art form, and one of the most valuable. It is not indifference to the audience. It is something more disciplined than that. A relationship with the work that is prior to and independent of the audience's reaction to it, that has been established in the private process of building the material, and that the performance simply carries into the room, regardless of what the room does with it. Carlin built that quality over years of nearly empty rooms and full ones, of bookings that turned out well and bookings that turned out as this one did. By the time the work he had been building found its audience in the early 1970s, it had been tested against enough reality, including the reality of rooms with almost no one in them, that it could stand on its own. The audience that eventually came to fill those rooms was arriving to find material that had not been built for them specifically, had not been shaped by the expectation of their reception, had been built for something prior to their arrival. The witness from that early, empty night would not have known George Carlin's name before they walked into the club. They did not know, sitting in that nearly empty room, that the comedian performing for almost nobody in a small club on a quiet night was going to become one of the most significant voices in American comedy. They had no context for what they were witnessing beyond the witnessing itself. But they remembered it. And what they remembered, the specific quality of a performance that was complete in itself, that was doing the work regardless of whether the work was being received, is the same quality that people who came to Carlin's work a decade later, in full rooms and on the recordings that preserved what he made, recognized and held on to. The room was nearly empty. The show was full. And the one person watching could feel the difference between a comedian going through the motions and a comedian who had come to that stage because the material required it, because the jokes needed to be said that night in that room for whatever audience was present. That is what the nearly empty rooms teach. Not technique, not timing, not how to work a crowd when the crowd is small. They teach the most fundamental thing: why you are there. Carlin was there because the work was there, and the work was always enough.